The following episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television. Good morning, USA, and welcome to another episode of the Bernie or Bust Show. Joe Biden's support from black voters is a grandfather clause. This is an interesting idea that I hadn't bumped into before by Sam McKenzie Jr. For many black voters, the former Vice President Joe Biden is their top pick in the 2020 presidential race to go up against white racism. And Biden's decisive lead among black voters resembles a grandfather clause. I got that far and I was thinking, does the grandfather clause apply to black voters or to Joe Biden? So, intrigued, I continued. After the Civil War, Southern states instituted a grandfather clause to enfranchise poor whites and justify black disenfranchisement. Okay, the grandfather clause exempted illiterate whites from voting restrictions like literacy tests, primarily intended to block black voters. Okay, so you have to wrap your mind around this. It's an interesting and complex argument. So there were black voters that were being excluded, just as there are laws now, there were laws then to exclude black voters. And the problem was that they were also excluding, well, let's just put it bluntly, they were excluding the kinds of voters who vote for Donald Trump today. After the Civil War, Southern states instituted a grandfather clause to allow illiterate white voters to keep voting. And now I think I understand he's comparing Joe Biden to illiterate white voters. Joe Biden is allowed, he gets a pass because he's been grandfathered in. He was allowed, he was acceptable in the past, even though, according to modern standards, he's not acceptable for a lot of reasons. Misogyny and racism being only two. Not to mention trade deals, not to mention his son Hunter's shenanigans. There are lots of reasons that he's disqualified. What it appears to me is that Joe Biden has been grandfathered in by black voters who wouldn't have accepted a younger version of Biden in the current day. That's how I interpret it. That's my take on it. So Biden's grandfather clause also exempts him from the literacy tests. And I looked at that. The literacy test means, is he tone deaf? Is he insensitive to racial issues today? And he obviously is, but he's been grandfathered in, and the old criteria are being used today to allow him to continue, and in the same way that white voters in the past were allowed to vote even though they didn't qualify according to the current voting laws. So Joe Biden is illiterate when it comes to black issues. He's tone deaf, he doesn't pass muster, but he's still being grandfathered in. According to the data I've read, he is more acceptable to older black voters than to younger black voters, which makes sense. This article makes sense. It explains things that I couldn't understand as well before I read it. Biden is inarticulate and illiterate about basic questions on race and white racism, and yet he retains support. Former President Barack Obama is Biden's political predecessor. And from Obama, Biden enjoys a level of support from black voters he never had. I want to see. Yeah, that's not a link. Yes, it is a link. Intelligencer. What does the history of black primary voting tell us about 2020? One of the key questions affecting the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination contest is whether the frontrunner candidate most reliant on strong African American support, Joe Biden, can hang on to that support in the face of opposition from two credible African American candidates, Harris and Booker. At present, Biden really does seem to be in the catbird seat, even after Harris drew blood with her much-discussed criticism of the former Veep's record on school desegregation in the first round of candidate debates. A new national survey from Quinnipiac shows Biden holding 53% of the African-American vote, with Bernie Sanders a distant second with 8% and Kamala Harris third at 7%. Harris, and even more so Booker, at this point mostly just have potential as candidates, with a special appeal to this community. What the ceiling is on that potential is not clear, but we have some fascinating historical data bearing on that question from NBC News. Thanks to the assistance of William Mayer, a political scientist at Northeastern University and an expert on presidential campaigns, NBC News has assembled for the first time a publicly available state-by-state record of the black vote for each of the 9 competitive national Democratic campaigns since the inception of widespread exit polling. That would have been in 1976, when Southern white moderate Governor Jimmy Carter made strong African American support, particularly in his own region where he was battling George Wallace, one of the cornerstones of his broad primary coalition. There were many theories about Carter's and subsequently other Southern white moderate Democratic candidates' appeal to black voters despite his very recent emergence from a Jim Crow heritage. With cultural affinity, African Americans were generally more comfortable with Carter's evangelical religiosity than were many white voters outside the South, and the backing of the King family ranking high. But 4 years later, Carter, amid domestic and foreign policy setbacks, was challenged for the Democratic nomination by the scion of a family with a powerful connection with black voters, Ted Kennedy. As Steve Kornacki notes in his write-up for NBC, African Americans split regionally. In the initial contests in his native South, Carter scored overwhelming statewide victories that were aided by black voters. In Alabama, for instance, he won heavily black areas by 3-1, according to estimates at the time. Proof, one black Carter supporter declared, that Edward Kennedy is not John Kennedy at all. Kennedy, though, was bypassing the South and banking on a strategy of winning big industrial states. In New York, where he notched his first significant victory, Kennedy bested Carter by 6 percentage points with black voters. In Pennsylvania, where his statewide margin was wider, he routed Carter by nearly 2-1 with black voters, according to NBC News black voter data analysis. In the end, Kennedy edged Carter among black voters overall, but there was a sense in the African American community that both candidates were ignoring its priorities. That's a good point. So in 1984, there was fresh interest in someone from that community running for president, and when no one else stepped forward, Jesse Jackson did, and everything changed. Jackson's campaign was paired with an extensive voter registration drive. The black share of the Democratic primary electorate doubled and even tripled in some states as Jackson's campaign triggered a wave of interest. His follow-up White House bid in 1988 only reinforced these trends. Taken together, his two campaigns centered the bond between African Americans and the Democratic Party and significantly increased the size, visibility, and clout of black voters within the party's coalition. According to exit polls, Jackson won 77% of the black vote in the 1984 primaries and elevated that showing to 92% in 1988. It helped that none of Jackson's Democratic rivals in either cycle had especially strong ties to the community, and when he chose not to run in 1992, the Carter-era strength of Southern white moderates returned as black voters gave Bill Clinton 70% of their votes in the primaries. So Jesse Jackson, with 92% of black support, connected that support to the Democratic Party. So former President Barack Obama is Biden's political predecessor in the same way that Bill Clinton was Jesse Jackson's political predecessor. No, I got it backwards. Jesse Jackson was Bill Clinton's predecessor. So that's what's going on. We've got this residual, vestigial effect going on. We've got leftover support. And that again goes along with the premise of this article, which is Biden has been grandfathered in. So he's riding not only the coattails of Barack Obama, he's surfing along in the wake of the Obama ship. So after the ship has sailed, there's still residual pull, and he's surfing along behind that pull. And that's where black voters inherited Biden as a defensive response to white racism. And that's why Biden's support among black voters remains a defensive response to white racism. So there's Jesse Jackson, there's the Democratic Party, and Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, this long-standing grandfathering that's been going on. And so Obama chose Biden, which allowed the grandfathering to happen. They selected Biden to insulate Obama from white racism. So there's Biden. He's Scranton Joe, and regular white folk will vote for a black president because he has a white VP. And somehow, I don't know, it's very complicated, but somehow that residual acceptance of Biden into this whole community of Democratic Southern voting is why Biden is still on top. In the BWR Essence Power of the Sister survey from August 2019, black women listed racism as the top threat to America's democracy. That's sort of like saying that environmental concerns are the top threat to America's safety. And they're both true. Racism is a top threat to America's democracy, which is why it's not okay to soft pedal the dangers of a Donald Trump presidency, which I've been accused of doing, by the way. And that's not my intention. My intention is to say that if you truly want to defeat Donald Trump, dangerous Donald Trump, then we have to make sure that a candidate who can defeat him gets the nomination. And what I've argued for months is that there's no way Biden can defeat him in the swing states, in the Rust Belt. Let me jump for a second to the comments of this article, to the last comment, and to the first comment. They're both relevant. If Biden was going to do something about racism, he had the perfect opportunity as vice president. He witnessed the vilest and most despicable racism in the history of our country hurled at a black president and his family, who he was sworn to honor and respect. He did very little to nothing because he was too busy colluding with his buddy Mitch McConnell. He can take his fake concern for blacks and shove it up his lily white blank. That's from R.D. Flynn Webb. Now the first comment, in reaction to this paragraph, in Biden, black voters utilize a grandfather clause to designate a candidate to deal with the white problem that whites need to handle themselves, but not by themselves. Again, we've got a really complex argument, and it is an excellent argument. At the end of the day, our choices for public office nationally rarely offer us what we need or what we want. We are always tending to concerns regarding white racism. Who will they like? Which devil is more less evil? Who at least hasn't said or done anything offensive to blacks? Who isn't overtly racist? Who can pretend or perform to appeal to our very low standards? It's a shame. So looking at white voters to see who they will accept is possibly part of the phenomenon we're watching here with Biden in southern states. It's tricky. It's really a tricky argument to unpack. Individual naysayers can say what they want, but the facts are plain and plentiful. Biden has more support among black voters than Senator Cory Booker and the former presidential candidate, Senator Kamala Harris. combined. The original grandfather clause harmed black voters, and Biden's grandfather clause harms black candidates. So Biden is getting this grandfathering in that keeps black candidates from receiving the black support they need. That's interesting. I'm not sure it's true, but it's an interesting hypothesis that we can explore. But black people are not solutions for white problems. These ideas are new to me and they're fascinating, and I've got to think about them. I'm sure I'm going to keep thinking about them over the next few months at least. Hopefully, and that was telling what I just said. Hopefully, though, we'll keep all of these issues on our radar, because if we're all in this together, not me, us, then we need to keep thinking about each other's concerns and each other's problems, and not just how can we appropriate, that's the right word here, how can we appropriate other people's concerns and speak to them enough so that we get their votes. That's been going on for a long time. And for anything authentic to happen, we need to not just look at these arguments. I have to admit, I'm looking at this argument because I'm trying to figure out why Biden has so much black support. So I'm looking into issues that don't affect me personally. So in a way, it's a kind of appropriation. I understand that. So for it to not be shallow and disingenuous, there has to be a true concern for all of us, from all of us, for each other, so that we keep going forward. And if Bernie is the person to do that, to unite us, it can only be because he truly is concerned. He's not paying lip service. He's not just saying what people want to hear, but he truly has a concern that matches Martin Luther King's concern, especially at the end of his life. Martin Luther King was pivoting from combating only racism to combating poverty. And he was forming a coalition, and Bernie Sanders guessed that was one of the main reasons he was assassinated. He was forming a coalition of poor people, poor black and white and Hispanic people who could work together to overcome the powers. If we're going to make it work, it has to be authentic. It has to be real. It can't be lip service. And this article and the comments showed that it has been lip service. It hasn't been real in the past, and it has to change. So that's my take on how white racism is on the ballot again, and white racism is a white problem. It isn't something that can be solved from the other side of the struggle. The author Richard Wright said, "There isn't any Negro problem, there's only a white problem." And Toni Morrison emphasized that whites should start thinking about what they can do about racism. And the activist scholar Steve Martineau says, racism is ultimately a relation between white people. That makes a lot of sense. In Biden, black voters utilize a grandfather clause to designate a candidate to deal with the white problem that whites need to handle themselves, but not by themselves. Unless whiteness becomes unconstitutional, the grandfather clause that black voters use to boost Biden will remain a constitutive force in presidential politics. Black voters who choose Biden as a defense against white racism are not the issue. The offense of white racism remains the issue. That's really good. That's really deep. And my ongoing issue is the media aren't going to tell us the truth about Joe Biden's electability. And it's a white problem again. It's a white problem that white people need to solve. What's going on in the Rust Belt with the devastation of NAFTA and the racism that's in the white Rust Belt? We have white voters in the Rust Belt who would vote directly for Donald Trump. They're Sanders supporters, Bernie Sanders supporters, but they'll vote directly for Donald Trump if Sanders isn't the nominee. So if what we've got here is a kind of a train wreck. We've got a train wreck between black voters in the South who have older black voters, not all black voters, but older black voters in the South have grandfathered Joe Biden in, and they think that he can defeat Donald Trump. And what they don't realize, the other train that's on the same tracks heading straight towards that coalition is a small group of white voters in the Rust Belt who decisively changed the course of history last time. In 2016, the conclusive statistical analysis shows that the white voters in the Rust Belt who were Sanders supporters and felt that Bernie was cheated out of the nomination turned around and voted directly for Donald Trump. And according to polling this time, they're ready to do it again. And the media don't want you to hear this. So if you're grandfathering Joe Biden in, and a lot of the argument is because he is the one you think can defeat Donald Trump. If Donald Trump's defeat is the primary issue, and it is, let me show you how that all works. Reuters Ipsos poll, Democratic primary tracker. So we've got all these issues. First one to pay attention to is that Bernie Sanders is at the top of this poll among Democratic voters. Bernie Sanders, they don't put his name at the top, but Bernie Sanders has 17% to Joe Biden's 15% to Elizabeth Warren's 10%, and everyone else is way down. And then it goes through issue by issue. Immigration, Bernie Sanders, strong on health care. These are the issues, and this is how important they are. So strong on health care, 13% see that as a top issue, and 12% don't know. 12% economy and job creation, but 32% prioritize beating Donald Trump in the general election. So Democratic voters and black voters are probably even higher. Defeating Donald Trump in the general election is their top concern, more than any other issue, more than any issue. So then we look at the issues, best on that particular issue. So on issues, Bernie Sanders edges out Joe Biden 19% to 18%, and then it breaks it down by issue. So healthcare, Bernie Sanders is staggeringly in the lead, almost double everybody else. And then with environment, again, way out in front. Economy and jobs, again, way out in front. Not as far in front, 24% to 18%, but he's leading in every issue, beating President Donald Trump. Now, here's the difference. On this issue, Joe Biden has 29%, Bernie Sanders has 15%, and don't know is 24%. Now, that's also telling. Strong progressive, Bernie is way ahead of the pack. And now he almost doubles. Even Elizabeth Warren, he's way ahead of Elizabeth Warren. Can unify the Democratic Party. That one is interesting. That one has Joe Biden, and that relates to the electability issue. If you think he's the one that can defeat Donald Trump, then you would also think that he can unify the party. So it's Joe Biden 23%, Bernie Sanders 18%. And then a new and different voice. Who has a new and different voice? And there you've got Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg almost in a tie. Bernie edges him out by 1 point. And then why do you support that candidate? They have the right ideas or policies is the top one. Good. They would make a good president. Good. And then that's it. It's very interesting because you can see that we have people voting for Joe Biden because they think he can beat Donald Trump. And what they're not telling you in the media is that he can't. Joe Biden absolutely cannot defeat Donald Trump because of these voters in swing states that will vote directly for Donald Trump. It gives them a double bite at the apple. It gives them twice as much power, twice as much leverage. And even though there aren't very many of them, it's a very close contest last time and this time. It will be close between Donald Trump and whoever runs against him. And the decisive factor will be the swing states. And those each will be very close. And therefore, it doesn't take that many of these swing voters, these Bernie or Trump voters, to change the course of history. They already did it once, and they'll do it again. So this idea that Joe Biden is more electable against Trump is just not true. So that's where the trains crash into each other. The only way to keep the trains from colliding is to get the word out to those who have grandfathered Joe Biden in that he can't win. He can't win. It's a myth. If you're voting for him because you think he can beat Trump, it's not going to happen because the coalition will fall apart. Biden will not unify those swing voters in the Rust Belt. Therefore, there will be a train wreck again, a horrible train wreck, because then we're stuck with Donald Trump again. So this is the message that the media won't tell you, because the media are working for people who would rather have Donald Trump than Bernie Sanders. So they don't care if you ever find out about this. So the only way to find out is to share the information. So you can share this meme. I made it big enough so that you can screen capture it if you want, or you can ask me and I'll just give it to you. And you can share this Bernie or Bust episode around, and maybe there's enough time left before, especially before South Carolina's primary, to make sure that people who are grandfathering in Joe Biden get this word that he's not electable, he can't win against Trump. And that message needs to be spread sooner, not later.
Get on board the Bernie or Bust train. Come get on board the Bernie or Bust train. Once you hear that clickety-clack, there ain't no time for turning back. Go get on board the Bernie or Bust train.
The preceding episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television.